Please be seated. The court is now back in session. I hand over to the civil party lawyers to continue his line of questioning. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I intend to speak in a measured way so as to make sure that the interpretation can be fully understandable. Professor, in terms of your experience and the knowledge you have acquired, can you tell me if the elimination of the elite and the intellectuals contributed to establishing the total institution as you referred to it in case number 1? Let me give my colleagues the ERN. In Khmer, it's 00 36 15 43. In English, it's 00 36 14 50. And in French, 00 36 17 04.
I'm sorry, could you give me the quotation literally? Because if it's a quotation of something I said at case 1, I want to make sure I can deal with that. Maybe you could pass me the English or pass it through the court officer. Or the French would do. I can read that also.
Oui, je dispose que de la...
I only have the French version, in fact, but you said that the entire country became a world that was isolated from the outside, and that's the context in which you refer to the total institution. A total institution is an expression used by an American sociologist, Erwin Goffman. He was the person who used the term to cover prisons, convents, schools, places that were sealed off from the rest of the world without any kind of contact with the outside world.
Okay, thank you. I was in that passage, I think it's from my S21 book, I was precisely referring to S21 as a total institution, but I think I may, in my testimony, as you suggest, have stretched that out to suggest that Cambodia, between April 17th, 75 and January 7th, 79, had been turned into a total institution by its isolation and by the controlling policies set in place by the regime. Earlier on, as part of this question, it seemed to me you were asking if the elimination of intellectuals had something to do with this. I missed, you might repeat that part of your question, because I don't want to come into that phrase elimination exactly, since many of them were failed to survive the regime, but many of them also did. So I don't like the word elimination. So we have to see what you had actually said before I get dealing with that issue. Marginalization might work, or...
The President, witness, please hold on, because there is an objection by the Defense Counsel for Nuon Chea. You may proceed, Counsel.
Thank you, Mr. President. As my colleague is answering the question of Professor Chandler, he may also clarify whether this term was indeed used in the context of S21 or in the context of democratic Kampuchea as a whole, because the professor is clearly not sure about this issue, so the input of our colleague would be helpful.
Je peux répondre donc.
Thank you. I can answer both of those questions. Let's begin with my learned colleague, and indeed, perhaps my answer will help Professor Chandler as well. The quote is, the country very quickly became a place that was closed off to the outside world. And on line 24, you talked about a total institution. And so the question I'm putting to the professor is, well, I agree that the term elimination is rather general in scope. Marginalization seems to me something of a euphemism, because a good many of the elites and the intellectuals were killed. So perhaps we can say reduced to silence. We can talk about reducing all of intellectuals and the elites to silence, and in so doing it became possible to set up the total institution as you define it.
Thank you for the clarification. I was, as you think on your feet, of course the word persecution is better than the ones I use. Persecution would seem to fit the criteria you've been mentioning. The intellectuals were reduced to silence. Indeed they were. And I want to make it clear that the category of intellectuals in Cambodia at this time, they call Nat Chet Dung, people who know how and people who have knowledge, were not primarily the graduates of Cambodia's single university at this time, but were people who had been through teachers' training, completed high school, so a very small group of intellectual people. They knew who they were. They could call themselves this in this category. They were certainly reduced to silence by the policies of the regime, but as I think I mentioned, they weren't reduced to silence in a way. I'm not doing a quibble. They were reduced to saying and doing only the things the regime wanted them to do. In other words, they were told to write their autobiographies. They were told to say who they were. They were made to speak out in certain ways. They were certainly reduced to silence in the way we think of the phrase of not being able to express ideas that might have helped the regime or attacked the regime or anything of that sort. And indeed, many of the memories from people who recalled the April 17th liberation or obliteration of Phnom Penh remembered that they wanted to, and these were people I've talked to who had been through high school and various things, they wanted to help the victors. They didn't know anything about the CPK. They felt the war was over. I've got a high school education. I can help. 100% these people were rejected by the party, except for, of course, the ones who were in the party already. And they were intellectuals. And I mentioned again the other day when they were trying to form this, CPK was trying to form a cabinet that would function in 1976. They did the best they could, looking around their own ranks for people who had some competence in the subjects that they were in charge of, like foreign affairs, commerce, and so on. I mentioned that. But certainly intellectuals as a whole were persecuted and marginalized and treated badly. That they were certainly not respected, and over again you get this disturbed a lot of ordinary Cambodians as well as intellectuals, very negative references to education. And Cambodians had, when I was in the 60s, had great respect for education. Education was the way you improved yourself, the way you got yourself a moral character, the way you learned things. And for the DKCPK to say education of that sort is useless, education is in the fields, is in work, that shocked a lot of people, and not just intellectuals, because that meant sort of, I'm inventing a conversation here with the permission or apologies. You mean my kids don't get to go to school? Yeah, your kids don't get to go to school. This is a new country. And so that was a kind of insult to another Cambodian tradition. I said earlier that the educational levels were low, but where schools were available, they were highly respected, and teachers were, as you mentioned earlier, a very respected class of society.
Merci, professeur.
Thank you, Professor. Since you said that they weren't necessarily eliminated, but rather that they were required to write or express themselves exclusively in terms of what Ankara wanted, then can we talk about controlling people's minds? Thought control? Would that be more accurate, perhaps?
I don't think it's a phrase the regime would have used, but I think it was something they were certainly trying to do. Any sort of freedom of thinking. This I mentioned earlier, little chalop, our teenaged agents would walk underneath houses to listen to people conversing. If anyone conversed in a foreign language, presumably to try and fool the people who were walking under the house, they were pulled out as traitors. So they were certainly, silenced. Whether their brains were washed, I think, is difficult to say. I think a lot of these people recovered with all the resilience that you'd expect, and a lot of them are alive today and are very important and interesting spokespeople for either Cambodia here or for the diaspora. But, there was certainly what we think of as thought was not respected. What was respected was hard work and obedience.
Nous venons de voir.
We've talked about education levels and the natural and cultural authority that was given to the figure of the teacher and freedom of thought as well. I'd like now to turn to another component of obedience, which is devaluing the victim. Are you aware of any facts or speeches, for that matter, that set out to devalue certain individuals or groups of persons and victims?
I can't answer that question without documentation, but I know that the confessions at S21 are filled with notations by Deutsch demeaning these people and saying that they're worthless, mendacious trash, saying that their statements so far, if the notes on a first confession, are totally worthless and you should be ashamed of yourself. So these people are basically being reduced to powder. Now, this clearly happened in some of the study sessions in the countryside. We've had reports of severe speeches and finger shaking at people who've been at all contentious. I don't have any, of course, transcripts of those conversations, but survivors remember being chewed out by cadre at study meetings. I'm sure we've seen some other documents today and yesterday that whole groups of people were set aside as special victims, special targets, especially adaptable to attack. The Vietnamese, former Lon Nol people, Buddhist monks. There were certain categories that were vehemently and systematically criticized in public and in front of them. When they were present in the audience at these study sessions, they heard themselves as a group being criticized. There's a lot of that going on. Exactly.
Thank you. Mr. President, I'd like to bring to the attention of the court a statement by a civil party referring to a specific insult. Can I give you the number? It's D22/622. In Khmer, should add that I do have quite a few statements that tend to go along the same lines, but I'll just quote one. Quote, the Khmer Rouge insult me always, you Achan. I can't quite understand what Achan means. You have no country, therefore you have to disappear. The insult lies in this Achan.
I think I'd have to see that written in Khmer. It's not a term I recognize, or as an insult. But At means you don't have. Chun, I can't think what Chun, that doesn't spring to mind.
The President, yes, please give it to the witness. But counsel, can you tell the court whether or not this document is in the list of the document put before the chamber before?
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, Mr. President. The document was submitted in due time, as you requested.
Of course, this is referring to the cham, and you said chom. Of course, the prefix in Cambodian, usually translated in English as the contemptible. It's a way of dropping people down, but that's sometimes a bit strong because children are called that without any hard feelings. But yeah, cham means the contemptible cham people who are off to one side. The contemptible sets them aside from other people. No, I mean, of course. I'm sorry to have taken the delay there. So,
Microphone for the speaker, please.
The President, counsel, please make sure that your microphone is activated before you speak.
Selon votre expérience et tout ce que vous avez...
In terms of your experience and your readings,
Est-ce que l'abandon des corps, des cadavres, sans aucune...
leaving corpses without any kind of burial, but just dumping them in the countryside to be savaged by wild beasts and worn down by the elements and rain and so on. For you, is this a form of devaluing the victims?
The President, witness, please hold on. There is an objection from the Defense Counsel for Nuon Chea. Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I object to that question. This is clearly not within the expert expertise of Professor Chandler. He may have an opinion on this as a human being, but he is here as a historian, and what his opinion is as to what devaluing the victim means is not relevant in this courtroom as part of this questioning.
Mr. President, I believe that my colleague is not completely clear about this. It is all that is necessary is to read many of the witness statements as well as the statements of the civil parties as Professor Chandler has done to understand that these people were profoundly traumatized by how bodies were disposed of, and in particular when they saw bodies floating down the Mekong River, for example. So I'm asking the professor only if, on the basis of his experience and on the basis of what he has read, if he is aware of this kind of treatment and of how people reacted to this. And so this indeed is the work of a historian, to say, yes, indeed I saw this, and the people were all, or maybe not, traumatized. This is what a historian should do. So maybe my colleague has not read enough statements in this regard.
The President. Counsel, you will not be given the floor to make any reply to this response. The President. Objection by the Defense Counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chia is sustained. This question is not appropriate to put to the witness, and this question is also rather leading in nature. So the witness is advised not to respond to the last question posed by the lawyer and lawyer for the civil party. If you have any further question, you may move on.
Okay, I will proceed, Mr. President. I'm going to quote again Professor, and here is the URN. This is your testimony in case 0036-1539 to 0036-1540, English 0036-4046 to 0036-1447, French 0036-1599 to 0036-1700. And I will quote, if we refer to Article 4 of the statutes, that says that is a firm revolutionary position in decision-making, management and work of the party. It is said, you must have the concept or attitude of managing work which is close to the masses within the cooperative and the revolutionary army, and have the initiative of autonomous creativity, and to have continuous dynamism and ebullient commitment. Can you, Professor, tell me if there was some kind of purge that was conducted towards elements that were considered lukewarm, we could say, not sufficiently committed?
I don't think you can say they were, I wouldn't use the word purge, which sounds more systematic. There's plenty of evidence from survivors and accounts and interviews once done that people were criticized sharply for not working hard enough and for not being enthusiastic enough toward the revolution. Of course, the statute is asking for the kind of conduct that is required of party members. And when you get to confessions in Tool slang, I'm not talking about the testimony themselves, which is inadmissible, but the accusations of these people were often that they had not been enthusiastic enough or strong enough in the revolution, and this was, in fact, the raison d'etre of putting them into the prison at all. So if you were a party member and really failed this element of the, or thought to have breached this line in the statute, you were in bad trouble. People in the countryside, new people and base people alike, according to quite a bit of testimony, it's not consistent, but we're often given a second or even a third chance. We were told not to do it again. I'm still observing you. So I don't want to use the word purge for that category. I don't think it's accurate.
Merci.
Thank you, Professor. Can you tell me if the system that was in place, which was trying to instill revolutionary enthusiasm, as I quoted by reading Article 4, whether there were any limitations in this? By requiring enthusiasm, the cadres would execute the orders they would receive in a creative way, and the orders that they were receiving. Did the senior leaders believe that this was a bit excessive, and that they tried to refrain this enthusiasm in any kind of way?
That's another good question. There's no evidence that it was systematically restrained. And if you notice, I think in one of the documents we read yesterday, they put the word leftist in quotation marks, and the word right is left out of quotation marks. In other words, right is counter-revolutionary, left is a good place to be, and how can you be a bad leftist? In other words, it's the same thing was happening in Mao's China. Left deviationism, as it was called, meaning being excessively leftist, was often not considered a crime but a virtue. So, in other words, this enthusiasm spilled over and was not repressed. Generally, it spilled over in lots of cases in which, for instance, from my last answer, people would not be given a second chance and so forth, or when people were executed in a kind of ad hoc way because of snap decisions by enthusiastic cadre. So, yeah, I mean, it's for them. By praising up to a limit, they're putting limitations on themselves. By knowing who the enemy is, they go after him. So in other words, this leaves us a great deal of freedom. We're suggesting this, I think, freedom of maneuver for the cadre who have to control themselves about how they're to behave. Now, it seems to me what you get from survivors' accounts is that the more experienced cadre, people who'd been in the party longer, had worked with, in many cases, the Vietnamese, but not necessarily, in the eastern zone, the southwest, and the north, they knew how to be somewhat flexible and be able to produce the kind of results they wanted. Where you had new, untrained, and especially young cadre, they would often deviate to the left. But I think I've seen no references to their being punished. One example, of course, makes it very macabre, but too enthusiastic questioning an S-21 that killed the prisoner was considered bad. I mean, that was when the beating went on too far, that guard was brought in and often killed. So, in fact, there was a repression at that level. But I don't like to, on the transcript, associate enthusiasm and killing because it's just not, it's ugly, but that's what happened.
Oh.
Thank you. We have seen a certain number of elements that describe this context of obedience. Can you tell me if there is any kind of connection between this and the crimes that were committed and that are on trial today?
The President. Please hold on, Professor. We'll hear the objection from the Defense Counsel for Nunchie first. Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is exactly what I was afraid of earlier when I made my comments. The Professor is now asked to opine on the use of the word obedience, but obedience in a very specific way, which is the psychological meaning of obedience. My colleague has made it clear that he means it in that way by referring to the Milgram experiment. The other option, the other possibility is that the professor is asked to opine on the concept of obedience in a legal way, and that is not his expertise either. So I object to this question, and the professor can be asked about issues relating to his expertise.
Just National Council for Mr. Kesampon, you may proceed. Thank you, Mr. President. Through the translation, I have heard that the civil party lawyer asked the experts to show whether there was a connection between the events at that time with what we are discussing in this trial. I am of the view that the expert cannot answer this legal question as it is rather the chamber's role to determine this connection. The President. Civil party lawyer, would you like to reply to the objections?
Merci, Monsieur le Professeur.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is clear that I'm not asking for a legal opinion here. I would never have taken that liberty. I simply notice that my colleague in the Kesampon defense has presented no objection to the elements that might be considered as describing this context of obedience, so to say. And then, the point here, and here I am responding to the Nuanchea defense, the point here is not to have a psychological opinion or a legal opinion, but simply to have the professor tell us if the elements that were brought up existed in conjunction with each other at one given moment in time. This is of a historical nature. He could tell us that if from such and such a period, in this case from 75 to 79, if all of these elements existed in a successive fashion during that period. That is to say, for example, I asked him questions about the level of education, on the status of professors, on the elimination or not of intellectuals, and each time there were answers provided that do not necessarily, of course, prove me right, but still, what we're trying to look for, what we're trying to understand is that if all of these elements existed together in a cumulative fashion under a certain kind of authority that was requiring enthusiasm and creativity on the part of the revolutionaries. That's all I am trying to understand.
President, the objections made by the defense teams are sustained. Professor, we will not answer the last question asked by civil party lawyer. If any, the civil party lawyer may proceed with a new question.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Professor, can you tell us if the elimination of religious leaders can be tied to the elimination of intellectuals? Or if this could be tied to thought policing, as what you referred to earlier on?
Well, certainly the removal from power of previous authority figures, including officers in the army, Buddhist monks, intellectuals and teachers, somewhat less systematically. There's several teachers, I don't know how many there were, but many teachers, enough teachers survived to provide quite a body of interesting evidence on the Khmer Rouge, because these were people who were educated and trained observers. But certainly the Buddhist monks were not allowed to continue to exercise their recognized and recognized powers. I'm not sure that this was different really from the kind of enforced atheism that accompanies revolutions. And if the Khmer Rouge, again, an intuition and supposition, had studied these revolutions, this would be one aspect that they could say, okay, one of the aspects is to throw out religious people. Every other revolution, except the American, which is the wrong one, has thrown these people out. So made sense that these people should be. And certainly it's to, as you've been talking before, the French word occurs to me, to put down any sort of voices that might make, I don't know, I sound like a Khmer Rouge supporter, I don't mean to, that make the job for the Khmer Rouge more difficult. If you have all the voices of former authority figures springing up in the villages and on the streets, you can do two things. You can listen to these people and everybody starts changing their mind or following them around, or you can shoot them. No, you do three things. Third thing is just put them down. Make them quiet, send them out in the fields, make them work. The Khmer Rouge, I think, thought, and given their resources, they may have been right, that the third solution was the only national one they could possibly achieve success with. That they didn't achieve success, however, is not surprising because it's a grotesque policy. But to make everyone do the same, not allow, particularly the people you've been talking about in your questions, intellectuals and monks and teachers, exercise in any way their former authority. Because as soon as when you get to your culture of obedience thing, I'm certainly not answering your previous question, but they would be afraid that new culture of obedience might be arise in which former students, former Buddhist laity, former, well, I guess you could say students, former soldiers who had obeyed their captains would all start doing this again with their voices. So, I mean, it's not, it's, yeah, I mean, running out of steam.
President, yes, counsel for Mr. Kirsampon, you may proceed. Counsel, thank you, Mr. President. It is a small issue. I noticed that when he is answering the questions, he is facing the counsel instead of facing the chamber. This is not appropriate in court. I would like the chambers to advise to the expert, the president. This is only a minor issue. It is a nature for human beings to talk face to face. Sometimes it is hard for us to speak without looking at someone else's face. And it is very hard to change someone's nature, requiring the person not to look at the face of someone to whom he is talking to.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. And furthermore, the civil parties are positioned in a rather awkward place, practically behind Mr. Chandler. And Duke indicates, and the Khmer ERN is 00 78 79 36 to 00 78 79 77. English 00 79 1976 to 00 79 2031. French 00 79 26 95 to 00 79 27 41. And this is a letter that, or rather, this is a document titled "The Lessons We Can Draw from Our Ancestors," and it explains that the word reactionary, such as described in the statutes, designated Catholicism. Can you, therefore, tell us why? And at the same time, I'll put another question to you. Can you explain to us the difference in the eyes of the Khmer Rouge between Christianity and Islam?
I don't think the Khmer Rouge considered these.
The President, please hold Mr. Chandler, yes, Defense Counsel, for Mr. Ainsworth. You may proceed. Counsel. Good afternoon, Mr. President. Just now, my learned friend only recalls the EIN number without referring to the identity of the document, so we cannot locate it. Besides, my learned friend refers also to the religious matter, and I don't think our expert has this kind of expertise.
Document.
This is document E-180. And at the same time, I can address this remark. Once again, I'm not asking for a personal opinion on such and such a religion, and simply saying that Professor Chandler, after reading many, many documents, might have been able to formulate an opinion on the vision that the Khmer Rouge might have had in regard to these religions.
The President, Professor does not have to answer this question because the answer to this question does not seem to contribute anything for the chamber to ascertain the truth.
Fine, Mr. President. Why, therefore, was Islam banned if this religion wasn't considered as reactionary?
The way you asked the first question seemed to require me to have an idea of the religious thinking of the Khmer Rouge, and I certainly have no expertise in that. I know that they had different views of Christianity and Islam. These views were connected with conditions on the ground in Cambodia. Christianity was associated in the Khmer Rouge mind with the Vietnamese. These, as we've seen from documents the last 3 days, were consistently seen as Cambodia's enemy, if not its major enemy. The Cham were considered in Cambodian society before the revolution as members of the Cambodian society, as the Vietnamese were not entirely considered in the pre-revolutionary times. Their religion was tolerated. I think what angered the Khmer Rouge about the Cham and about their stubbornness at holding on to their religion, not the attributes of the religion itself. Reactionary is what they called it, but I think they knew almost nothing about Islam. What they did see is they saw people who were refusing to abandon their religion, refusing to accept the new religion, in quotation marks, of the Khmer Rouge.
Merci, Professeur.
Thank you, Professor. So, was religion a way to identify the Cham?
Well, it was one of many. Their clothing, their temples, their language was often. Many of them knew Khmer, but they had language of their own related to Indonesian and Malay. They were instantly recognizable to anyone on a street in Kampot or Kampong Cham in pre-revolutionary days. This business of perhaps looking different was enough, in a way, to anger the Khmer Rouge, just as the city dwellers with their Western clothing angered them. The Cham were set aside as people who were resistant and can't say unwilling, but not cooperating with the regime. So religion was certainly an aspect, but we've come across in the Constitution, I think 2 days ago, the wonderful phrasing, the Cambodians are free to practice any religion, but all reactionary religions are out. So there's no religion that the Khmer Rouge didn't think was reactionary. So maybe you could find, I'm making a joke here, I'm sorry, maybe that's not permitted, but Scientology might have been okay, but that wasn't in Cambodia at the time. The other religions existed were reactionary. So in other words, the Constitution itself, by indirection, after first making a phrase that be pleasing to an overseas audience, then made it clear that there was really no patience or tolerance for religious activity. And this is, of course, one of the things that set the Cham aside. Another one, which shows up in all the documents and suggests why the attacks on the Cham did not begin immediately in 1975, is that the Cham were not considered to be enemies of the state in the same way that the Vietnamese were. Another reason why the repression started is the Cham, unlike other portions of the population, in individual cases, began actively to revolt against the Khmer Rouge in 1976. This led the Khmer Rouge to change their mind and find that these people were inherently dangerous, and this led to the systematic persecution of these people that happened later on. Not for their religious beliefs, but for their refusal to accept and their behavior.
Thank you, Professor. I'd now like to read E3/178 to you. In Khmer, ERN 00275597 to 98. In English, 00342708 to 23. French, 00623304 to 21. This is the weekly report of the Region 5 Committee. 17 April elements from Phnom Penh are the Hoa Cham, and they have protested in the refectory of the cooperative on the subject of their beliefs and of the need to consume food in a manner that is in keeping with their religion. He related Article 10 of the Constitution to substantiate his arguments. In the light of the situation, we took steps, and in particular, finding the string and the head of the movement so as to cleanse it. So I'm coming back now to the question of consumption and food and eating pork. My question is, after religion, was the obligation to eat pork a way of identifying the chams and to sweep clean those who did not wish to eat pork? And perhaps you could enlighten us on the meaning of sweeping clean in this sense.
Well, sweeping clean, bosamat, is the Cambodian phrase for purge. I think they knew who the chams were already. My impression from the things I've read, and I've read a good deal about this in my work, although I've never concentrated on it, is that a lot of this forcing to eat pork can't be described as anything else but just sadism, just something that they could do that they knew would hurt and offend, isolate. But I don't think it was used as a test, say as circumcision was used in the Holocaust, as a way of identifying the cham. I think the cham were not trying to conceal themselves. They were known to be. They were known who they were. But the pork was just to further humiliate, and it's just one of the many aspects of just kind of day-to-day sadism of that the cadre had in Cambodia.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Professor. Just before you said that the cham did not rebel before 1975. So can I draw your attention to document 21.3? ERN Khmer 0000 8494, in English 0018 50 64 to 65, French 0038 6260. What we're looking at here is telegram 15 to respected comrade Bang Pol. In principle, the zone has taken out 50,000 inhabitants and has sent them to the north, and more than 100,000 Muslims remain in the northeast zone. And along the river and along the border, the principal elements remain, but not in the district. Of Bang Knu Mun. Their removal was to break them up in accordance with your views in discussions with us already. The date of this is the 30th of November 1975. And my question is, if there was never any rebellious opposition from the Cham, why was it necessary to organize their deportation and to break them up?
Thank you. I stand corrected there. I don't think this telegram is is a document that I've seen. It certainly is authentic, and it shows that a certain amount of pressure was being put on the Cham in, I think, the east. Well, I guess they call it the northeast around Kacheprali, as early as November 1975. I don't think this document in itself is evidence of revolts, but it's quite possible that I was wrong in suggesting that there weren't any revolts in 75. The motive for breaking the Cham up, I think, is, again, without being stated, is simply, as it's doing, is to break them up. These are autonomous, systematic communities with patterns of authority, consistency of religion, a shared local history, exactly the sorts of nodules, if you like, that the regime wanted to break up along with families, city dwellers, army people, Buddhist monks. They represented an implicit threat by just maintaining their collective identity, which, of course, they were very eager to maintain and continue to maintain until they were broken up. So I take back my statement of revolts not before 76. That was just a memory of mine that they started in early. There were a couple fairly small but distressing to the regime uprisings in the East. They could well be connected with this November date. So I revised my previous statement because I'd never seen this. I don't remember seeing this telegram, frankly.
Merci, professeur.
Thank you, Professor. I do believe that your attitude and your response should be reassuring to the defence, because when you do not know the answer to a question, you openly say so. Can I come back now to what you were saying about a policy to distinguish people? We were referring to eating pork and religious practice and so forth, and now I'd like to read out a passage from document D125/75.1. I had submitted this in advance, Mr. President, and here we're talking about a woman, a civil party, who says that in 1978 a group of people came to her village in the West Zone, and she said, "I'm the only one who escaped because I disguised myself to look as if I came from another race." At the end of 1978, the Khmer Rouge assigned Cham men, starting with the adolescents, to building houses in a faraway village. About 20 people left our village to do that job, and then they came back and they told us the new house is ready, and the Cham came to live in the new village. On the order of the Khmer Rouge, my mother, my grandmother, and my brothers and myself went to the Wat, and I got there at about 8 o'clock in the morning. There are about 30 Cham families waiting there to board a boat. All of those who were waiting were female except for some very young boys. I was about to get on the boat with my mother when a cadre appeared and pulled me back. I was placed in a group of about 40 unmarried girls. I looked back at my mother and my brothers and sisters. We girls were ordered to walk to Treya village. And then, jumping a passage, it goes on to say the cadres asked, "What is your race?" The first to answer admitted the truth, that she was Cham. And others gave the same answer. Then my turn came. I lied and said I was Khmer. Ho, the cadre, pulled me off against a wall. Seeing that, the next 10 girls after me also said they were Khmer, and they were put alongside me. A moment later, those who had answered that they were Cham were taken down below the house. I watched them through the cracks in the wall. It was late at night, but I could still see the scene clearly in the moonlight. I saw them march a girl blindfolded with a scarf to the riverbank opposite the house. Then a cadre pulled the girl's head back using the scarf and cut her throat. all the other girls who said that they were Cham were also had their throats cut. I'm trying to answer here to your comment on the distinction that was applied to the Cham. Professor Chandler, in your view, were the Cham subjected to a policy of extermination?
That was a appalling, very moving passage. Thank you for reading it. At the very beginning, would you give me the date of the event again, please? When did the event occur? You read something. I want to make sure I got it right.
Oui. Faut juste que je...
Let me just find the reference. In 1978. At the end of 1978.
That helps me to answer the question. By the end, and I can answer it very briefly, by the end of 1978, the Khmer Rouge certainly had a policy of exterminating the Cham. By the end of 1978, they had a policy of eliminating the Vietnamese. They had a policy, their public statements began to refer to the Puit, or the race, the Cambodian race. It was not a word they'd used much before. It, of course, has absolutely nothing to do with Marxist-Leninist terminology. It's a term that was meant to encourage the Cambodian citizens to pursue, engage, and win a race war against the Vietnamese, and by extension, not against the Cham, but against anyone else in the country who was not Khmer. So I think the key point is 78. I think in the day one or day two, day one probably, I mentioned the various phases of the purges, and the last phase of the purges, perhaps the, if you like, craziest moments of the regime as it was coming apart at the center and all at the fringes also, was this very strong racist component, which can't be pushed back. The racist component can't be pushed back, at least in documents, to 75, 76. Certainly, you get things like the document you first showed me, a Cham person being called Acham, which means I don't respect you, you're lower than me. But the whole racial killing for, obviously in this case, racial, not religious, racial reasons, is a 78 phenomenon connected with the raids into Vietnam conducted by the Khmer Rouge forces, whose object was, as we've seen from other documents submitted in the case, were to kill Vietnamese because they were Vietnamese, not because they were yet at war with Cambodia, but because they were Vietnamese. So the very moving passage has to be put into the context of that final, Damarung of the Khmer Rouge, the implosion. It's part of that. So it's inexcusable and awful, but that's where it fits in history.
The President. Lawyer, can you advise the chamber as to how much time do you think you will need to finish up with your question?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll try and close before 1:15 with just a couple more questions. I'll go very fast.
President, thank you for your indication. And court officer, please communicate this to the court management section to ensure that the transport is still here to transport all the staff back to the town. You may now proceed.
Vraiment merci.
I'm very indebted to you, Mr. President. Professor, I'm going to be going rather speedily now. You referred to the date of 1978 in explaining to us what that signified in terms of the overall project. Let me refer to D125/98, Khmer ERN 0021 8553 to 54, English 0024 20 87 to 88. This is now 1977. The executions culminated in 1977. Most of the victims were new people. But in September and October 1977, there were a good many Cham who were massacred. In the Wat of Outrakun. I cannot remember the dates clearly, but in 1977, my unit leader came and told me that militiamen with long swords needed help. And he had 4 of us living there, go to Sambo Meas with the militiamen. And then in that village, they arrested all the villagers. The work they had me and the 3 others do was to take those villagers to Wat Outrakun. They did not tie up those victims. All the villagers were afraid. Some cried out, but no one dared to run away. I felt very sorry for all those villagers because most were people I knew. We had been fishing together. When we arrived at the Outrakun security office, they separated the villagers. The women were pushed into the temple building. Then they struck each of the male villagers with steel clubs to break their spirits. Then they detained them in the temple building. I did not personally see the killings, but my friend Moon, who climbed palm trees, told me that they'd taken all of those villagers and killed them. One night from 7 p.m. until midnight, including the children. They grabbed those children by the legs and swung them against tree trunks and then threw the bodies into pits along with the adults. The pits located near the bamboo grove, east of the pagoda. There were also women prisoners there, but they were not tied up. And then Moon said to me that they had not even detained them one night. They took them to the bamboo grove, which was the killing site, and they never reappeared. No one told me the reason, but I had observed that they organized opposition against the Cham. Anyone who was not Cambodian. This is before 1978. So my question I want to raise here is the kind of connection that there was between Pol Pot and Khieu Samphan.
The President, I note the Defense Counsel for Ieng Sary is on his feet. You may proceed, Counsel. Counsel Angadam. Thank you, Mr. President. I know that we are running out of time. I am sorry. I would like to raise an objection, and the witness said very clearly already earlier on that there was no indication of the religious persecution against Cham people, And the question that is being posed by the lawyer now is legal by nature. It is not so much about history. I don't think that this question is appropriate, and I am objecting on this basis. Thank you.
Je ne comprends pas l'objection.
I can't understand the objection here. I don't see why this is a legal question. I'm going to need to have that explained. More importantly, I think that we're reaching 4:15 already, and I won't be able to complete my questions. I don't know if that was part of the scheme of things.
The President, the objection is not sustained. The witness is instructed to respond to the last question posed by the lawyer.
The passage read indicates there was certainly some vindictive action against the Cham. I'm a little worried, really trying to be helpful, but a little worried that the 77 does not have a month with it, because these Cham, if this was in, and I also didn't get the zone where these people were living, the idea of a river sounds like it's the eastern zone. If it's the eastern zone, this may be part of the whole purge against everybody who lived there for tolerating and failing to resist the Vietnamese invasion. I'm not saying that's what it was. These were certainly Chams picked out and killed without a covering statement. You closed your statement, and I'm not certain if this isn't when the other counsel stood up. You mentioned the name Pol Pot, Khieu Samphan without contextualizing them. Now, maybe you didn't complete your question. The words came to me, Pol Pot, Khieu Samphan, from you. I'm not sure what you were saying about them. It wasn't clear to me.
Il y a une confusion.
Yes, there was a slight confusion here. With respect to that testimony, I was talking about September and October 1977. Now, picking up on Pol Pot and Khieu Samphan, what I wanted to do was raise the question of the relationships between those two individuals. But I dare say I'm going to be forced to drop this question unless the President authorizes me to go beyond quarter past.
President, the time is now appropriate for the day adjournment. And the lawyer for the civil party is running out of time to put the question to the witness in question. I note the defense counsel is on his feet. You may proceed. Counsel Angadam. Mr. President, Your Honors, I would like to request once again that the chamber maintain the transcript of the testimony of Mr. David Chandler, and I would also like to ask the chamber to also keep the notes of Mr. Chandler as well, whether he made it here or at home, because if there is an appeal in a later date, then it may be also subject to the decision of the chamber as well. And if the chamber failed to keep these records, then I am afraid that we will not have that document for discussion. So once again, I know that the document should be in the possession of the chamber on a temporary basis. The President, the chamber once again reject this request for the second time, and we have already ruled upon this. The chamber will not review its decision by itself. The handwritten notes by the witness in response to the question posed by him is a normal course of activity of anyone who is attending a meeting or a session like this, because people tend to take notes of what is going on before they can respond to any question or discussion. Now, the Defense Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'll be very brief. I think I can shed some light on this transcript issue just for everyone's benefit. We very helpfully received an email from Ms. Senabu Diop of the transcription unit, and she assured us that a Khmer transcript would be sent around at the end of the day, and that an English language transcript and perhaps a French transcript, they would attempt to send it very early on Monday. It's out of their hands. They've been very helpful, very accommodating, so I'd just like to make that clear. We will get the Khmer transcript by the end of the day. Also, we have a joint request. We're happy to give our colleague across the stage a bit more time if that's necessary. We would like to have 1 day per team. I know we've been allocated 2.5 amongst the three of us. We think 1 day for each team is appropriate given the length and the substance of Professor Chandler's testimony. We would, of course, endeavor to finish within the 2.5 days, but if we could, as a starting point, have 1 day each. That's our request, and we think that's quite reasonable, and we hope that our colleagues certainly won't object to that. We've been accommodating with them in the past. Thank you.
The President, the request is not granted. We have already indicated very clearly that the three defense teams will have 2.5 days unless there were any disruption. For example, if there were disruption due to the procedural matters by the other parties, then times may be compensated accordingly. For example, this morning the prosecution asked for an extension of 15 more minutes of their times, and we granted that request due to the fact that there were some procedural matter that we had to deal with before we started examining this witness. But we will not grant the request based on the reason you have just raised. And secondly, as I mentioned earlier concerning the transcription is not within the responsibility of the chamber. It is under the management of the court management section. And I wish to once again emphasize that the transcript may not be as what you have just described. The transcript in English and French will need at least 1 or 2 days following the conclusion of each day's hearing. As for the draft transcript in Khmer language, is made available at the end of each day's hearing. So if it is helpful, you may coordinate with your national counterpart in the discussion of your preparation for the question for the witness. The time is now appropriate for adjournment. We call it a day today, and the hearing will resume next Monday starting from 9 a.m. in the morning. And the scheduled hearing for Monday next week will begin with the question put by the defense teams, beginning with the defense team for Nguyen Chie. As for Professor David Chandler, your testimony has not yet come to an end, and we will resume the examination of your testimony next Monday. So we would like to once again invite you to come to the court to testify on Monday next week. And we wish you a very pleasant stay over the weekend in Phnom Penh. And court officer is instructed to facilitate the accommodation and transport of Professor Chandler and make sure that he will be brought in the court again next Monday before 9 o'clock. And security guards are instructed to bring all the accused to the detention facility and bring them back to this courtroom on Monday before 9 o'clock. The court is now adjourned.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ